talk to me about what you guys are actually doing. What are your main projects? How do your day work?
Oh, that is a wide question. I mean, I think, I'm going to ignore your question and I'm going to start with sort of how we got here, because I think people often ask me, like,
is there any point me being here?
Yeah, no, if you could just...
I'll just drink the free water.
People often ask me how you get into inclusion, or how did you get into this career? And I don't think it's something, I didn't wake up at 6 and go, I really want to just like work in diversity and inclusion. I think we're all here because we have a love of film, and we have either sort of tried to do that in various different ways or different parts, but then kind of having the lived experience of being someone with various protected characteristics, you sort of become passionate about trying to make sure that everybody that looks like you or looks like anybody or is like anyone is kind of included in the industry. So I think so we all have a different story. So I think it's kind of quite interesting to hear what those are. But anyway, I came from an academic background. So my study was always in film, television. A lot of my projects were about representation. I was always trying to, I think, locate myself in film and TV that I loved watching so much, and sort of understand what that meant to me by watching things, as everybody does, and came into the BFI about 6 years ago to do a research project around diversity data and looking at representation on screen. So that was specifically for our Black Star project. Do you remember that? Yep. In 2016? Because in the programming of that project, a lot of the program and a lot of the films were about American stars. So they were sort of like, where are the British Black stars? Where have they gone to? What is the problem here? So I was essentially tasked with looking at that over a 10-year period, looking at our archive and our catalogue, and trying to locate those Black stars in British film and sort of seeing whether they played lead roles, whether they spoke, kind of where they were, what genre they were in. And that led me to get asked a lot of questions about, well, what's the BFI doing about that? Because the representation in that data project was pretty low, to be honest. I mean, I don't think it was surprising, but a lot of the stories we heard, and we had a keynote from David Oyelowo, who was talking about why he left the UK, because there were more stories for him to act in the US. So I think that speaks nicely to kind of why we're here and what we do, because our industry is an industry, it's a business. So if it's not representative on screen or off screen, we have a real problem with a talent drain and people not seeing themselves in it or believing that they can get into it. And currently we have a massive skills shortage in the UK and in UK film, a real boom in production, which is great, but not enough people to fill those roles. So I think we can't really afford not to be inclusive and try and get as many people into the industry as possible. So that's part of what we do. And our focus has always been quite industry focused, and just recently we've had some moves. We've got a new CEO who has made some changes. We've got quite a new exec, some new structures, new titles, really terrible job titles that are very long but kind of describe everything that we do. And our move has been, with the expansion of the team, also to sort of look inwards. So I think it was becoming kind of increasingly difficult to talk to industry, where we have a pretty good reputation around how we help the industry and what we do, but without looking at what we're doing as well and what we look like as an organisation and how we're leading by example. So some of the work we do now is kind of more internal. So my role in the team, apart from having to look after these lot, they don't take much looking after at all, is to kind of head up our strategy, make sure our team are well and looked after, because this work can be difficult and challenging at times, and also to bring my knowledge around accountability and reporting and data to look at what we do and make sure that we're making informed decisions about the work that we're trying to do in this area, so that we're not just scrabbling around trying to do things without really knowing where the problems are or where the gaps are, but that we're informed about what we're doing and that our policy reflects where the gaps are and what we want to tackle. And also just to keep up to date with, which is, inclusion is an ever moving landscape in terms of language and where things are and what the politics are. So just trying to keep up with that. A lot of the work is advocacy. So we've just all got back from the Toronto Film Festival, talking to partners over there and sort of seeing how we can form collaborations and do work in partnership. And and looking after our main bodies of work and our policies, which are essentially the diversity standards and our bullying and harassment and racism policy, which is feeds into the people we fund and the partners that we fund, in order that they are following what we would like to see them do.
Okay.
So that's it.
Excellent. I'm going to ask someone else a question
Yeah.
in the hope that they will answer the question that I asked. let's give it a go. Miranda, so we've Mel's given us a really good overview of what the whole team is doing. So let's work our way down the line and understand the difference between your different responsibilities.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, my role title is Projects and Partnerships Lead. But I've always actually found job titles to be somewhat obscure, especially when you work in inclusion, because as Mel mentioned, the work itself is and should be constantly changing and adapting and shifting. Therefore, role definitions aren't always helpful, because we as a team try to be as nimble and open to evolving our work within the inclusion space as much as possible. So it's sometimes hard to describe, but essentially my role is one whose purpose is to connect and collaborate, to understand what conversations are being had around the diversity inclusion, and to ensure that we as the BFI not only include ourselves in those conversations, but also give voice to our values, and in order to sort of affect positive change in the industry. And that can face both ways, internally within the organisation itself, with other BFI departments and colleagues on projects that perhaps are either designed to explore or support our diversity and inclusion strategy. For instance, we work very closely with our audiences team and our film funds. But I also do a lot of external industry-facing work, building our partnerships across both the UK and international film industries, thinking intersectionally to pinpoint common goals, of which there are always many, and to build robust networks in order to continue and keep up to date with the ever-changing, hopefully improving discourse, and to enable collaboration where before there was perhaps none. And I think this is really important to us as a team, because essentially that's what inclusion is. It's to ensure that everyone feels included, feels safe, feels able to speak without trepidation, and nurturing these networks, developing these partnerships enables us all to sort of foster a more inclusive work environment across the world of film, TV, and games. At least that's the aim. That's the goal.
What about for you, Rico? What was your kind of your area covering?
Sure. So I kind of came into this role in an atypical route because I actually started out in programming. So I was a programmer for and I created my own festival in Birmingham called CineQ that prioritizes the perspectives of queer, trans, and intersex people of colour. And then kind of took a route into a filmmaker. And so a lot of my frustrations with the way the industry currently works is from lived experience, about the barriers I experienced when I was trying to build a career for myself inside the industry, the conversations I was having with, like, you know, my siblings about, you know, some of the barriers that they've experienced and how they seem to be homogenous, seem to be the same. So came into this role very much thinking about how to dismantle some of those barriers and address some of the disparities that we have in terms of racial equity, racial equality. And so in my role as race equality lead, what I'm currently doing is breaking that down into a really simple way of viewing things, because I don't believe that we can go external as a BFI and talk about all the amazing things that we do without addressing some of the disparities we have in-house. So I break it down into people, policy, practice, and partnerships, and that's largely with people, about how we treat each other, our organizational culture, the ways that we hold each other with care and consideration, and also what we're doing to sustain that. So what we're doing to sustain positive culture. Then there's policy, which is all about how our policies uphold that change. So moving to a zero tolerance policy for bullying and harassment, for example, or even making equitable practices such as if people of colour experience racism inside the organisation or outside the organisation in their work, we have our employee assistance programme where they can get sessions of 3 counselling. The disparity between someone experiencing racism going to that service and saying, look, I experienced racism, I want to talk to a black therapist because I don't want to explain the nuances of race to a white therapist, just making sure our systems are equitable. And then there's practice, which is the kind of fundamental stuff we do, which is a lot more outfacing. So making sure 30% of our, our internal targets, 30% of our program is authentically ethnically diverse or inclusive, or making sure that 30% of the films we fund are ethnically diverse or black or global majority or inclusive. And then finally, there's partnerships, which I work quite closely with Miranda on, and that's identifying that whilst public funded organisations are always strapped to a resource, comparatively we are quite well resourced and we do have a lot of reputability as a BFI. If we muscle into spaces that Black-led or queer-led or disabled-led organisations are doing brilliant work, and we just decide that we're going to allot, £250,000 to do this work, will essentially eclipse the organisations that already exist that are doing brilliant work in the sector. And actually a better way for us to work is to develop equitable partnerships by where we offer our resource to them and also partner with them to add reputability to those organisations to avoid that from, to stop that from happening. So that's a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment.
Excellent. And Claire, because you're new.
I'm new.
You're the newest of the newest. So,
I'm a baby.
So have you worked it out yet? What you're supposed to be doing?
Honestly, we're getting there. Every day is it's a day of learning.
Yeah. So tell us where you're at the moment.
Okay.
Because it could change by next week.
It could.
As you learn more stuff. So
true.
That's where it is now.
So true. Well, I feel like this is the thing. So I'm disability equality lead, and obviously the disability community is huge. It's ginormous. There's in the UK, there's 14.7 million people who are disabled, and that's 22% of the population. And within that, there's so many different nuances, different perspectives, different access requirements that it's quite, it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to accommodate all of those different needs and all of those different, perspectives and visions. But I think the thing that I always think about disability is that it can happen to anyone. Any single person in this room can become disabled at some point in their life. And with as we're going with aging and everything, that is more likely to happen. And that's exactly what happened to me. So I wasn't always disabled. I became disabled at 15. So I'm visually impaired, legally blind. And I kind of found that film was that safe space for me and really fueled my passion. Ironically, can't see it, but that's when I found my passion for film, which was really nice. And I kind of I'm slightly different to people here, is that my background's in biomedical engineering. So I really wanted to understand how I could help disabled people systemically and from a technological point of view. Then this wonderful role opened up. And I think not being able to see myself in stories and not being able to see disabled people playing disabled parts really ignited this passion in me that there's something that needs to change. And then originally I wanted to do production and that sort of thing, but I got told straight to my face that you're blind, you can't drive, you'll never make it in this industry. And that's the sort of ableism that we don't need. We don't need that. Yeah. So working at the BFI, this new role is completely new. It's a really wonderful, exciting opportunity to make a change for disabled people. So the sort of things that I do, well, again, still very new to all of this, but it's going well. We have a wonderful festival that celebrates disabled practitioners' work, which really takes a moment. So I work really closely with Miranda on that. So Miranda did that last year and she completely smashed it out the park. She did. Other things that we were doing, again, what Rico mentioned with partnerships, it's again helping disabled people and supporting their work and amplifying their voices, because they are the experts in their own unique perspectives in their own ways, and they can offer amazing individual things. So really just amplifying their work is the best that we can do. That's some of the stuff that I'm currently working on.
Brilliant. So so we've got this kind of nice sort of overview of what everybody's doing. And so can we go back to my original question? Talk us about how you're going through. Yeah, let's go. Like, talk us about through like a typical week. What's going on? Do you see what I mean? What sort of things are you dealing with? Do you see what I mean? I want to see how this compares to a typical week for me.
There is no typical week. Yeah, that's the
Oh
answer.
my God, are you kidding?
There is no typical week. No day is the same. I'm trying to think what I've done today, from talking about advising about data and a quality monitoring form for our new funds, to speaking to a consultant that we're working with on anti-racist training for our senior leadership team, to doing a panel on inclusion. I mean, that's three of the things that I've done today.
I mean, Rico and I are currently working with LFF, London Film Festival, to set up a day of events for our BFI networks. So I helped set up and co-chair our BFI Queer Network. We also have the Race Equality Network, and in the making, a Disability Equality Network.
That's what I was working on today.
So we're working with LFF to sort of provide those networks with some fun events, some contextual events, so that we can all feel included within the festival, which is gargantuan, a bit of a behemoth. So
it could be, internal consult. Quite a lot of it is consultation, either internally or externally. So we get a lot of questions from either from our perspective or from our expertise in this work, about how to do work inclusively. So that could be, like I say, advising about data in our equality monitoring forms, or speaking to LFF about access, or,
Facebook
there's
was mentioned earlier today, wasn't it?
Facebook, yes, sort of externally consulting with people on how they might adopt our policies or our standards, or do their inclusive work in the same way. It could be us going and advocating or doing panels at festivals. Ironically, so much diversity in the work that we do. Because I think when you're talking about inclusion, you're talking about everybody. So I think people often think you're talking about a minority of people. You're actually talking about everyone. You're trying to make sure everybody is included in the work that we do, feels that way, that we're inclusive when we're talking to people. We've got to make sure our language is correct, that we're approaching people. We're learning all the time. We don't always get things right either. So it's constantly moving, which makes it incredibly tiring, but also it can be really rewarding, because it's just, you don't know what's going to happen of a day, and you're learning all the time, which I think is great.
So, like, help people to kind of, like, obviously, because one of the projects that I know you guys are working on is this sort of evolution of the diversity standards. So that whole process. So help people to understand where the diversity standards came from, or what they cover, and then what the sort of process of kind of evolving them and building them for the next period of time actually involves.
Yeah, so the diversity standards are a sort of typical example of the kind of work that we do. I think we're all really bored of initiatives. So I think the diversity landscape previously was very much like, there's a problem over here in the pipeline, so we'll train 20 people, and then, like, we've done diversity, it's all fixed, and then we'd sort of get to another report and we're like, there's no more people in the industry. How are we gonna, how did that happen? We'll do another thing, and then we'll do 30 people, and that'll make it better. And I think the diversity standards are an example of something where it was a policy that was set up, my caveat before I got there, but it was a policy that was set up as we're a funder, as the BFI does so many diverse things. One of the things is that we fund films through our national lottery funding, and it was set up for our production specifically to guide people through how they might be more inclusive or create a more diverse set on screen and off screen for their project. So there are 4 standards that look at on-screen representation and stereotypes and stories. The second one looks at kind of creative control and heads of department. The third one is around development, so mentoring opportunities or promotional opportunities to help retention in the industry, because retention is a problem. And the last one is around audiences, so who your film is facing. They were set up in 2016, internal. As a funder, we can say, this is how we would like you to think about your project. as part of your funding requirements. So they were set up like that. They're a funding requirement for our funds, but then our funds have become more diverse in themselves. So they have been slightly tacked onto to adapt for a TV fund that we had. And then, you know, they're being used by BAFTA now on their film and television and games awards. So we had to change some wording so that they made some sense for games. And people have used them in theatre, and AMPAS have taken them for the Oscars. So they've been used in all sorts of ways, but they kind of became this monster of trying to tack things on to all the different ways they're being used in different global contexts. You know, they were very British, based on the Equality Act. They were very focused on our work and on our production. So part of the work and talking about reporting and accountability that I did when I came in was to kind of quantify what they'd done so far. So to look at them, create data around how people were engaging with the standards, and then commissioned a review of them. So since they're set up in 2016, apart from tacking on these bits of wording that said actors and presenters, because we're talking about television, they hadn't really been rewritten, and they were very internal and very sort of corporate as well, because they were written for us. So we've just commissioned a review last year, I think it was. We'll say last year. And we talked to 150 of our stakeholders, from the unions, from people who have used the standards, from people who don't use the standards, studios, critical friends, of which we have many, and asked them around, you know, what they thought of them, how they're being used, how they could be improved. We've taken all of that feedback and put that into a rewrite of the standards, which is refreshing them, trying to make them more relevant for the way that they're being used, trying to increase adoption, because what we really want is something that is a standard that everybody is using as a guide to doing this work properly. And also not something that we're going to throw in the bin because we're like, oh God, that didn't work, we'll try something else. We want a long-term intervention that we look at, we review. If it's not working, we'll change it, because that's what this work is. The work is innovative, it's iterative. If anybody was getting it right, we would be out of a job. So which we hope for one day, by the way. That's the plan. So if we're doing it right, we don't need to be here to tell people. So what we want is something that people can use, and that we will get wrong and change and adapt and use the data and use reporting to see where we're at. And that seems like a sensible way of moving forward.
Yeah, and it's also important to say that, like, a lot of the things all the things we do are led by data. They're led by the way the industry currently is. So the reason we have a disability equality lead, the reason we have a race equality lead, and the reason we focus on social mobility is because those are the things that we're currently underserving as an industry statistically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and that's the thing that's interesting about that, is that, well, different organisations will talk about that in different ways and manifest that in different ways. Ultimately, it's the same three key underrepresented areas right across the industry. So we're talking about disability, socioeconomic diversity, and ethnicity, but then within each of those, there is really interesting nuance in terms of in each particular area. So it'd be quite interesting to kind of explore some of that and how that kind of manifests, because, like, obviously there's an interesting area with regards to disability, because it's one of the only areas where we can positively discriminate in the area of disability because of the massive underrepresentation. So tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that you're working on, Claire, and some of the key kind of bits that you've kind of got you're talking to people about, and people are looking for support for.
Yeah, definitely. So first off, to say we have a wonderful group called the DSAG, which stands for
rebrand.
We need to rebrand. Okay, don't worry, guys. We'll brainstorm this afterwards. But it's called Disability Screen Advisory Group, and now that's filled with, I think, 12 really wonderful disabled film, TV, talent, theatre, all come together, and they really help us to advise on our policies and what we do within the BFI around disability and what we decide to do and how we decide to act on certain things. So, for example, one of the members of the DSAG helped us recently we've recently acquired the IMAX. Wonderful news. Glad to have it back. And now, historically, that is quite an inaccessible building. So from a perspective of audiences, it's a nightmare, to be honest. But having Dan come in and go around and do an access audit and really like let us see the real visuals of like how difficult it is to be mobile around that building was incredibly impactful. And already we've enacted some of those changes. So having those small changes already happen is really exciting to see, and to know that we're making an impact that will actually be beneficial to disabled audiences.
Has that fed into, like, because obviously there's a big refurb of the
Yes.
IMAX coming, so is
It's
that
all going
feeding
into that, yeah. So they've already made some changes, like some small things such as like carpet, but it's a phased thing.
Yeah.
So there's obviously like some huge things that are like a couple of years down the line, but like the things that they can do in this refurb, they're going to get done, which is great.
Yeah.
We love that.
Yeah. For example, because at the IMAX, you go in at the front, and you climb up the stairs.
Yeah.
And so if you're a wheelchair user, you can get a lift and sit at the back. If you're a wheelchair user and you wanted to do a panel at the front, you can't do that. So that's probably a long-term, that's a kind of structural thing that we're going to have to brainstorm about how that's going to work.
Yeah.
But that's sort of one of the things that we're thinking about. So really trying to think
Similar to the BFI NFT1 stage that is now fully accessible. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think we used to have a temporary ramp, and then we were like, you could just replace it with one that is always accessible, and that will cost you less money because you're not renting a ramp every time. Mm-hmm. So it's things like that, really trying to think. And the point about the terribly named ESAG is what we try and do, where we have a lot of lived experience, but we don't have all of the lived experience at all. And I think so, we try and do, we use the disability community's saying, which is nothing about us without us. And we try and do that with everything we do. So if we don't have all the answers at all, we try and do things in partnership, as Rico was saying, with other people to inform what we're doing, because we don't always see that. I'm not disabled, and so I walk around and don't think about those things. So it's really useful just sometimes having somebody literally walk you through their experience to understand, like, we need to do something about that.
I mean, it's an unfortunate acronym, but it's a good name for a group.
It's the SAG, I think.
SAG.
They're a lovely group. Yeah.
And so, in terms of like looking at some, one of the things that's interesting that obviously we don't have in your team at the moment is a sort of a kind of a social mobility lead. Do you know what I mean?
But we do. Funny you should say that. No, so we have we do have a consultant on social mobility who works with us, Danny Lee, who is a film critic for the Financial Times, but also he used to work at the BFI as a curator, the contemporary fiction curator, and he ran a huge weekend around social mobility at the BFI, and really spearheaded our work in collecting social mobility data for the people that we fund and employ, and setting a target for that. So he's continued to work with us since he's left the BFI, doing that work, because it does feel like something that talking about intersectionality. A lot of the problems and a lot of the barriers to access to our industry are financial. It's something that was set up for people who kind of had time and money to be able to make films, which generally don't make money if you're in the independent sector, or not often. So it's kind of, it's almost like a hobby. So I think, but it's turned into this huge industry. So a lot of the barriers across the board are financial. So it feels really important to sort of tackle that. So the work that he's done has meant that we've set a target for working class representation, actually, for the people that we fund and the people that we employ. He's been working with the Social Mobility Commission and the government to do that work, and we'll be creating a toolkit and some advice around how to do this work that's coming out later this year with BAFTA. He's vital, but we didn't invite. I should have invited him, shouldn't I? I feel bad now. I've been not very inclusive.
Yeah.
See, we don't always get it right.
Wow. It's also really interesting because I think social mobility is one of the things that isn't covered by the Equalities Act 2010. Yeah. So actually understanding social mobility and how to monitor social mobility, because like I said, everything we do is evidence based, it's data based. So how do we capture what percentage of our industry, of our audiences are from low income and working class backgrounds, and so that's been really interesting. Really interesting.
How are you guys defining the kind of threshold for lower socioeconomic diversity?
So we're taking the advice from the guy. I'm not sure how I feel about it fully. It's a very new area. But so what we're doing now, so the advice from the government is that you ask a question about your main breadwinner at the age of 14. So that speaks to your background at that time, so where you've come from. But I think there are loads of questions. So that's what the target is based on, and that's what they did the metrics around. So it's a 39% target.
We also include the school that you went to,
and then so that's if you ask one question, ask that one. But we also include one about public and private schools, but that is a different metric because that is talking about the numbers for that are different. So that we don't have a target for that, but we ask that one as well because I think it speaks a lot to the makeup of people who work in our industry. That's fact. Sure. And then also, but I think there's some really interesting work always evolving, always to be done. Around data and protected characteristics and identity because it's so personal. So there's a real balance between having a form that people will fill in because they feel like they're on that form, but also one that maps against data and baselines that are set by the Office of National Statistics or by our government. So there's a real kind of negotiation, which I find my nerdy academic brain is like data. So I find it really interesting, but I think there's some real work to be done and work that we're going to be doing as an organisation over the next few years with these. So the targets that we have, which aren't punitive, they are about like what good looks like, what does the baseline look like, what does our population look like, and what are we doing against that? But really thinking about how we can be more nuanced, how we can be more intersectional, how we can talk about how people feel about their identity. So, there's some interesting work in Australia where they ask people like, well, what do you feel? What class do you feel like you are? Which isn't what you are, but it's a different question.
Always a very different answer.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's still interesting. What is the mobility? How are we tracking how people have come from here and gone to there? So they might have come from a working class background, but working in film are probably like firmly middle class at this point, point. So I think there's some really interesting work to be done. But for now, we listen to the government and they say breadwinner at 14. So that's how we do it. We do now. So a few years back, we set we didn't have targets before, and our head of inclusion before, Jen Smith, she set targets for who we fund. So again, a lot of our work is kind of production focused because that's the lens through which people see us through what is programmed at our cinemas and what we fund, right? So, and who we are. So initially those targets were set on who we fund in our film fund and so writer, director, producer in the main, and then who we employ, because that is data that we collect and we publish that data. It's up on our web pages if you can find anything on our web pages. Just Google it.
Wow.
If you Google BFI Inclusion
Did you just throw the web team under the bus?
It's changing though.
You just retracted that.
It's changing. We've got new
universal truth, everybody. It's up on our web pages. So we cut that data and publish that every year against our targets. Yeah. Just recently, so we have a new 10-year strategy coming, a corporate strategy, and then also our national lottery strategy. So all of our funds are being relaunched today. Yeah. They've been relaunched today. And so with that, we've taken the opportunity to say, right, these targets are BFI targets that will cut across everything we do, but there is a difference between. Oh God! See, why ask me a question about data? I'll be here all day. But there is a difference. But yeah, all right, I'll be quick. But there is a difference between the ability to collect data on who you're employing and control who you're employing than there is around who your audience is and who walks into the building. There are ways in which you can target people through membership and that sort of thing, or what you're programming, but they're very different. So the other thing, again, with this work being iterative, so we've set the targets as a baseline, but that is a live, constant conversation that we'll be having about how we are collecting that data, whether they make sense for all parts of the organisation, whether there are different questions we need to be asking in different places. So, yeah.
And obviously, the targets and will manifest in different ways depending on what you're talking about. So when we're talking about audiences walking into the building and those sorts of targets versus the films that we're holding in the archive, those targets will have to work in different ways because they get expressed upon different sorts of in different contexts.
I think that's always a journey, and like what I say is, any action that comes from inaction is always tokenism. But if we embed learning, we can stop doing actions that are performative and start doing things that are formative. I think we need to get really comfortable with the fact that, like, these communities have been underserved, and we can't do anything without tapping into these communities and getting honest feedback from these communities. Obviously, being an organisation that's done a small amount but could do more, reaching out to these organisations off the back of something like the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd is obviously going to be performative. It's obviously going to be tokenistic. But what we can do is ensure that these are systemic changes that prevent changes from being tokenistic.
and putting people in place to kind of do all these sorts of things. None of these jobs existed a decade ago in this organisation. So that in itself, the fact that there's a would promote those, and potentially there's a sort of film that feels like a matinee, but perhaps there's a more grown-up type of a matinee that we could be doing, or there's different ways to think about how we would program those sorts of slots. How we
I
don't work anymore.
We don't program either.
Do you see what I mean? But I am like that sort of an idea. Like, do you see what I mean? It's
Same
very
argument for
exciting.
new mothers as well, isn't it? They don't
Exactly.
want to
That's
see-
a really exciting idea in terms of, you know,
It timing was different in those days, and then come home after the matinee, and it was well known. But it's not necessarily that. Something a bit more meat to it, and a bit something out of whatever you're programming that
yeah,
month.
I think
Yeah,
that's
I
a
hear
fantastic
Yeah.
idea. That the idea of making titles more available to people who are using different parts of the day in different ways.
Yeah.
And
These titles that would typically sit in the evening, making them available earlier in the day for
There's
different types
so
of
much
audiences. I
on the
think it's-
program. And two is I can't. It's far too late. I won't get home till midnight.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's if the buses and trains are running.
Yeah,
Yeah.
completely.
I think
Just
it's
a
really-
thought.
It's an
Yeah.
excellent thought.
I think
Do
you
you see
also
what I mean?
make a
I can
really-
see Joel's mind ticking away there, right? As
I
well.
think you make
Yeah,
also make a really valid point about democratizing programming. Like sometimes we don't know what our audiences want, and sometimes we need those conversations with audiences. So I think that's also a really valid point, Claire.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm also currently working on trying to make, I'm not going to make this generalization, but like aging and also dementia friendly venue. But I feel like there's always this stereotypical sterilization.
We know what you mean.
Generalization.
Generalization. There we go. That old people want to see old films. They just want to be, but exactly. And I think that's the conversation. I'll give it.
We'll put them on at 12 o'clock. We're there
Sex and violence.
with a
Yeah.
trigger warning.
Bodies.
But that is.
Definitely. So, talking to the program team and the box office team, we're definitely aware that like a reasonable proportion of our customers book through our telephone systems by coming in and look at our a physical brochure and not a digital brochure. So we are conscious of it. I can't say for definite because I don't work in that department, but I don't see that the BFI will do that because they know they'll be ostracizing a huge part of our
Yeah,
audiences.
no. There was a huge campaign to try and get rid of the brochure during lockdown because it was an expense that some people didn't think was necessary, but we fought back on that very hard. So
And same for the program notes.
Yeah.
You know, that's been talked about before in the paper, but everybody loves them so much. So we have a digital version, but there's
we also have
a paper version as well.
we're an archive after all.
Yeah, we're archive and we're all cinephiles, so we get it. You know, that's what makes our venue unique. So we wouldn't be advocating for that at all.